Hello friends, we're glad you're back. My name is John Flug. I'm the pastor here at First Presbyterian Church in Winsboro, Texas, and this is James Spurgeon. He is the elder in charge of the Christian education in this congregation, and together we've been working on an Old Testament series, a video series, where we go through each of the books of the Old Testament to describe in essence what that book in particular is about. Today we're on the book of Ruth, which is one of the historical books in the Old Testament. And so I'll begin our questioning, our interview with this, James. Who is Ruth? I mean, it's obviously a name. The book is named after someone, so tell us, who is she?
Ruth is a Moabite.
Any more? Can you add to that?
Well, Ruth is a daughter-in-law of Naomi, and she is from the land of Moab. She is not one of the children of Israel. And so her story is sort of an odd story to find in the Bible, in fact. So
she would be considered, by a full-blood Israelite, she would be considered a foreigner then?
Yes, she's a Gentile.
Okay. Tell us about who wrote the book of Ruth and when it was written.
Well, we don't know who wrote the book of Ruth. Quite possibly it has the same feel to it as Judges does. It was quite possibly written during the time of David. Perhaps in the early part of his reign. Ruth is, it's a beautiful little book of 4 chapters. If you've been trudging through 30 and 40 chapter books each week and you come to this week, relax. Maybe read some New Testament, because you only got 4 chapters to read in Ruth. So that's what I did. I threw in some New Testament with my reading when I read Ruth. But Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. And so in Judges we have this book where things start off on a high note at the end of Joshua, and then they just start spiraling out of control till the end of Judges. We think, what in the world is God doing? And then we get this beautiful little window into what God is doing. We get this window of grace, and that's the book of Ruth.
So we've got this early time period of Israel as a nation, and we get these 2 books, and they really stand, for this time period in Israel, they really stand in stark contrast to one another.
Yes, they do. As I mentioned, Judges just goes downhill. It starts off well, it ends in civil war and chaos. It starts off with a pretty good judge, and the judges gradually get worse and worse and worse till we come to Samson, who's while he's still a picture of faith, I mean, he basically he's born a Nazarite from birth, and yet we see him violate just about every aspect of that Nazarite vow until he's finally violated it all, and God takes away his power. And so by the time we're done with Judges, we want to throw up our hands and say, what is God doing? And, well, God is working. And in that sense, it gives us a picture. God is always working, even when we're not aware of it. God is doing something. God is making something beautiful out of all of the chaos and the ugliness that we see in the world.
Okay. So everything that could go wrong does go wrong in the book of Judges. But in Ruth, we actually see some things go right. And these happen at approximately the same time, right?
Yes.
So we do see some
good
in the midst of the bad.
Yes, at some point toward the end of Judges, you have this little story of Ruth and Naomi.
Yeah. Okay. Well, whet our appetite a little bit. Give us a summary of what to expect when we read through those 4 chapters. Give us a summary of the book of Ruth, if you can.
Very nice story. 4 short chapters. Basically what happens is this. There's a man named Elimelech, and he is married to Naomi. And there's a famine in the land. Well, when we're reading the book and we see that there's a famine, we understand that this is during one of those down cycles when the children of Israel have disobeyed God and they have forsaken the Lord and they have gone after the Baals and the Ashtaroth, the foreign gods. And so God has done what he said he would do. He sent a famine.
Mm-hmm.
This is us reading between the lines. And so instead of repenting and turning back to the Lord the way they should, Elimelech forsakes the promised land and goes down to Moab. And immediately...
Tell us a little bit about Moab.
Well, Moab has dark origins in the Bible. If you'll remember back to the book of Genesis, The people of Moab come about as a result of the incestuous relationship between Lot and one of his daughters. And so when the original readers are reading this story, they go, wow, Moab.
Not a good choice, huh?
No, Elimelech is just making bad choices. And so he goes, and predictably, when they get there, Elimelech dies. And then his two sons take Moabite wives. And we read that and shrug our shoulders and think, well, of course, they were living there, they would marry there. But that's forbidden. It was forbidden of the people of Israel to marry wives from the nations around them, because God said if you marry those, if you take wives from the people around you, you will adopt their gods. And so they take wives, Moabite wives, and then they die. And all of this we kind of see coming. If we're the original readers, we go, well, yeah, this was going to happen. And so then Naomi hears good news from afar. She hears that there's grain again in the land of Bethlehem, where she's from.
Which is in Israel.
In Israel. And so she decides she's going to return, and she calls her daughters-in-law. Now, her daughters-in-law are expected. They have no means to take care of themselves unless they have a husband, because in the culture of the day, there just wasn't the means. And so they are expectantly looking to Naomi, and Naomi says, well, the best I can tell you is just go back to your houses and try to marry someone else, because I'm going to return. And so there's a lot of tears, and one of the daughters-in-law, I believe her name was Orpah, and she says, she cries and hugs Naomi and goes and leaves. But Ruth says, I'm not going. I'm going to go with you. And where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Which is a great step of faith. She understands that to go to Israel means that she is going to become a part of the covenant people. God is going to be her God. And so she says, I'm going with you. And so she does. Mm-hmm. And so they return. And there's a big to-do. When Ruth returns, there's a big deal.
How would the people of Israel view a foreign woman coming into their land, especially a Moabite?
They would have had no respect for a Moabite. And so Ruth is looked down upon because of her culture, because of her nation of origin. She's pretty much ignored. If you read between the lines in the way the Hebrew is written, she is basically ignored when they return to Bethlehem. And now, because Naomi is old, or maybe perhaps because she's in despair, she doesn't even go out to try to glean. It's harvest time. Mm-hmm. And they had something, there's a provision in the law of Moses that the people can, they have not a welfare, but a workfare, mm-hmm. sort of. The farmers are not allowed to harvest the entirety of their crops. They're supposed to leave the corners unharvested, leave certain sections unharvested, so the poor people can go through and harvest. And so that's what Ruth goes out to do. She goes out to harvest. She chooses a field and goes. And then we're introduced to a character named Boaz. And as soon as we're introduced to him, we know that he's a godly character, because he greets his workers with a blessing from the Lord. How goes it with you? And then he notices Ruth. Everybody else has spent the entire day ignoring Ruth. He notices her. He asks about her. He shows concern for her. And he tells his workers, make sure you leave plenty on purpose, handfuls on purpose, for her to glean, so that she does not go hungry. Probably in consideration of the fact that if she were in other places, they would do the opposite of that. Right. They would shut her out. They would tend to shun her. So he wants to make sure she's taken care of. And so when she returns that night to Naomi, Naomi's jaw drops open at the amount of grain that she brings back. It's just incredible. Where have you been? What happened? Well, I was in the field of this man named Boaz. And Naomi begins to become excited. Boaz, he's a kinsman. He's related to us. And it speaks to another provision in the law of Moses. It says if a man dies and has no children, then his brother is to take his wife and raise up offspring for his name. Well, it looks as if we know that Elimelech's two sons don't have brothers. And so there's really no one to marry Ruth and produce children for Elimelech. But here's a kinsman. He's not a brother, but he's close.
Maybe like an uncle or a cousin or something.
Someone like that. And so Naomi gets excited. Well, go back again. And make sure when you go glean in his field that you stay with the women that are there and be careful, she tells Ruth. And so they come up with this plan where Ruth does everything but ask Boaz to marry her, which, obviously she couldn't do in that culture, but she basically does everything but that.
Yeah.
And then Boaz realizes the situation, and he takes... not sure how to explain this, but he takes certain precautions to make sure that Ruth's reputation is kept intact. And we see his upstanding, the way that his comportment is upstanding throughout the entire story.
Right.
And Boaz is just comes across as a wonderful person. And so he tells her, I am indeed a kinsman, but there's a kinsman closer than me. And so I'll go sit in the city gate, and we'll see if this other kinsman exercises his option to redeem you first.
So what that means is in the Mosaic law, the closest relative had the first dibs, if you will.
Yes.
They had the first chance, the first opportunity to get what was left behind by that relative.
Yes. So in our vernacular, we say this other gentleman had dibs.
Had dibs.
Okay. So Boaz sits down and says, "There's this particular field that belonged to Elimelech, and you are the one who is closest to redeem that field. Do you want to redeem that field?" And the man says, "Well, yes, I'll redeem that field." And then he says, "Oh, by the way, there's a catch to it. There's a Moabite woman who goes with it. And if you redeem the field, you redeem her, and you are obligated to raise up children for Elimelech." And the guy goes, "Yeah,
He wasn't as interested in that.
I don't think I'm quite as interested now." And so he doesn't. He opts out. And so then Boaz steps in, marries Ruth, and they have children. At the end of the story, it's a beautiful picture of the grandchild being placed in Naomi's hands. And so at the beginning of the story, Naomi's in despair and thinks she's forsaken of the Lord, only to find out that she hasn't been forsaken of the Lord at all, in spite of her bad steps, her sin, and in spite of her doubt. So it's a beautiful picture of grace.
Yeah.
God being faithful to his people even when they are unfaithful to him.
And again, I just want to point out, in the despair of Judges, this witness of grace is just a remarkable contrast.
Yes.
Tell us, what can we learn then, now that we know the gist of the story of Ruth, what can we learn from this story about the character of God?
God is faithful. God is graceful. God gives us so much grace that we're just so undeserving of anything that God gives us. And this is basically the entire story of the Bible. It's the story of human failure and God's love for us in spite of that failure, and God doing a work of grace and redemption in the world in spite of the fact that the world does not deserve it, and in fact that the world hates God. And so we see story after story like this one where people fail God, and yet God is faithful. And so God is a faithful God, and God is a God of grace, and God is at work. When we think that God is not working, He is. Mm-hmm. In ways that we cannot even comprehend. And I've said this before, but I just have this picture in my mind in heaven, and that there's a movie theater somewhere, and the marquee says, "Come see the story of what God was doing when such and such happened." So every day you can go in there, and it's featuring God, and you get to see the whole other side of the story of some event in history that you knew about and you had no idea what God was doing. I just think that we'll spend a lot of time in the next world discovering the wonderful things that God was doing in this that we had no idea. And Ruth is just a small